Settled is one of the biggest creators in the old school RuneScape niche, and if you've been browsing around RuneScape videos at all, you've probably seen one of his thumbnails and just needed to click it. Today, we're going to uncover some of the secrets about how his thumbnails are made by, well, recreating one. The thumbnail we're going to be recreating is for a video titled The Prison Teleport, which has amassed over 1 million views. I wanted to do this because I'm obsessed with what makes someone want to click a thumbnail on YouTube. As a professional artist, I've worked directly with Jagex in making some of their official trailers for old school RuneScape and made thousands of thumbnails across the YouTube platform. Perhaps you've seen some. I'm always looking for unique ways and challenges to improve my skills, and I thought this would be a great opportunity to push myself. Let's dive in. And now that we're in Photoshop, our first step is to insert our picture of the prison, and then, using the original as a guide, position it so it mostly lines up. At this moment, I know something really cool. The prison door is all warped and exaggerated, so we can just simply use the perspective tool to adjust it accordingly. This really helps exaggerate the proportions of the prison door and draw the viewer's attention in, as it looks really strange and unique. From here, I painted in the walls and the floor to match the exaggeration and fill in any parts that aren't covered by the screenshot. Look, if it looks a little weird here, that's absolutely fine. The key is just to trust in the process. Now it is time to draw our attention to the ever-elusive prison bars, which need a fair bit of love. The outside should really be looking brighter than the inside, so I increased the exposure of all the areas outside the prison bars. I then painted the sharp triangular shadows that come off the base of the bars and added additional shadows that sit along the base of the wall. At this moment, I was beginning to be a little bit unsure of myself. See, there's this massive amount of painting to do, and it can get super cumbersome super fast. You can easily get lost in adding excessive details that don't help you achieve the end product. It was now time to add in the most fun element, the tiles. Using the original as a reference, I popped them into Photoshop, applied the perspective warp, and lined them all up properly. In hindsight, it actually would have been a much better idea to make all the tiles one singular asset and adjust them just as one, but we all make mistakes, and learning is honestly the best bit. To make the tiles a little bit chunkier and add a little bit more depth, I added these subtle little shadows underneath. With that, it was now secret spicy time, the dark shadows around the walls. I started by painting a really broad vignette, and then I focused on this far wall. This makes the composition seem less flat and more three-dimensional. I then repeated the same process for the base of the walls. While the composition is starting to come together, it was still looking a little bit like donkey doo-doo. And if my process so far seems a little bit sporadic, that's because it is. I often find when working in this style, it's really beneficial to put it together in pieces. It is now time to bring our focus to the tiles and make them glow. I started with this nice strong green mist that emanates up the walls, and then added some layer stars to the tiles themselves, and then painted the red that goes up the walls and that enters from the bars, working with some basic shapes and then erasing them. I then added a final little bit of chunkiness to the tiles to help really make them pop and stand out. This then revealed my next glaring issue. The prison bars, they looked like way too flat and weren't interacting properly with the light. I added some subtle highlights to give them a little bit of shine, but I decided I would return to them later. I had one other more important element to tend to right now, and that element was the prison window. This thumbnail has a prison window which does not exist in the original screenshot or in-game in any way. There are 3 main ways we can fake elements like this. We can go into Blender and remake it if we want to be really, really accurate. Or we can composite a photograph, but compositing a photograph with this kind of graphics doesn't always go as good as we'd expect. Or our last option is, we can draw it in. We decided to draw it in, and since RuneScape is pretty easy to work with due to its really flat shapes, it was not too hard to do. Now, it does look pretty pathetic now, but once we add some shadows and highlights, it's gonna look fine. Don't worry too much about it. It is now time to return to the original bars, and we're gonna touch them up a little bit more. We're gonna add a subtle gradient for some color and bloom, and then add some additional shadows. And for our last touch, add a slight red glow coming off the red tile, and additional highlights. And I repeated this exact same process for our little window we just painted as well. I still wasn't really happy with this wall in the background, so I added some additional shadows to add some extra depth, and then adjusted the exposure and color of the floor to make our tiles stand out just that tiny bit more. It is now time for the final, most complicated element, the player character. I actually spent a fair bit of time trying to line this screenshot up, and I just couldn't get the feet right, so I messaged 8sat, the original creator of the thumbnail, and my suspicions were correct. The character model is several screenshots that are stitched together, and that's why the proportions are a little bit odd. But I wasn't too picky on this detail, so I let it slide and stuck with my original screenshot that I'd gotten earlier. I masked them out. It was now time to paint some really basic ground shadows. It was now time to start working on painting the various glows and shadows on the character to make their body parts really pop out and look like they actually belong in the environment. I went through the following process to get this done. I started with the green highlights, focusing on the shoulders, hat, and feet. Then, the various shadows. The important thing when painting shadows and highlights is that they create separation and contrast between the various elements on the character. The whole point is to make it as clear and visible as possible. I then did the red light from the front, and then some white light on the shoulder, and some subtle other final touch-ups. From here, it was now actually starting to look pretty close to finish, but there was still some time for some final spice. The last step here was I merged the layers and loaded them into Adobe Camera Raw. This is the thumbnail artist's secret weapon. When working with Camera Raw, I often encourage people to just slide the sliders everywhere, play around and see what tickles your pickle and what disgusts you. Once you get something that you're really happy with, lock it in. When I finished up with Camera Raw, I realized there were still some minor issues that I need to touch up, so I darkened the bars slightly so they look a little bit more realistic with the incoming light, and sharpened the bars on the window by adding some sharp highlights. And there we have it. The end result was really close to the original. There's some subtle differences. Mine's a little bit brighter, but overall, I'm really happy with how it came out. So what have we learned? A simple composition can be super effective, and you should really fixate all of your editing to make your subject and story stand out as clear as possible. And that's just about what every element did here. We have the exaggerated proportions of the door. We have lighting painted in to make the door stand out as much as possible, to make the tiles stand out as much as possible, and to make the character stand out as much as possible, while the background faded off into the distance. Everything is about clarity in this thumbnail and allowing the viewer to learn what the video is about as quickly as possible. And lastly, don't be afraid to paint in completely custom lighting if it helps your subject stand out as much as possible. If you want more videos like this, feel free to subscribe to the channel. And if you ever want to see the full uncut process of creating a thumbnail, I create thumbnails live over on Twitch, so give that a follow as well.